Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back to a place that smelled exactly as bad as you think it did, and probably worse. So go ahead and dim the lights, pull the blankets close, and let's talk about why you, me, or frankly anyone with even a shred of modern sensibilities wouldn't last a single day in a Civil War camp. Because sure, the history books like to talk about grand battles and famous generals, but the real story, the slow, grimy, sleepless one, was lived in the spaces between battles. The tents, the trenches, the overcooked beans. The waiting. The smells. And did I mention the smells? Imagine you've just enlisted. You pictured yourself as a rugged hero, maybe even a little handsome in uniform. Reality greets you with a canvas tent that's already damp before you've even stepped inside. The floor is mud. The bed is, well, the floor. And you're sharing it with 6 other people who all snore like they're competing for some kind of very unpleasant trophy. Congratulations, you've arrived. The first thing that might surprise you is how little fighting actually happened. If you thought a Civil War soldier spent his days charging bravely into battle, not quite. Most of your life would be drilling, marching, waiting, writing sad letters home, waiting some more, and eating food that even raccoons would politely decline. You'd think boredom would be the least of your worries in a war, but no, boredom was the main event. And then there was disease. If the bullets didn't get you, the germs probably would. Camp sanitation was, let's be generous and call it, optimistic. Latrines were dug too close to the water supply, hand-washing was practically a rumor, and medical knowledge was just slightly behind, let's guess and hope. Diarrhea, not gunfire, was the leading cause of death in the Civil War. Romantic, isn't it? You'd wake up every day wondering if the cramps you felt were from hunger, spoiled bacon, or the beginning of something far less polite. The food situation alone would break most of us. Hardtack was the staple, a cracker so hard you could theoretically use it as a building material. Soldiers joked that you didn't eat hardtack, you soaked it until it surrendered. If you were unlucky, it came with a few bonus weevils inside. Protein, technically. Some soldiers roasted them for flavor, which is the kind of detail that really makes you think about how desperate mealtimes must have been. And if you think coffee would save you, yes, there was coffee, sometimes. But supplies ran out, and people got creative. They brewed substitutes out of roasted acorns, chicory, or basically anything brown that could be boiled. One soldier described it as tasting like burnt hope. Still, they drank it anyway, because the only thing worse than war was war without caffeine. Let's talk about personal space, because you wouldn't have any. Sleeping arrangements meant lying shoulder to shoulder, sometimes even spooning with strangers just to stay warm. If you were lucky, your tent mates were quiet, clean, and kind. More likely, someone was coughing, someone was complaining, and someone was stealing your blanket. Lice were considered inevitable. Everyone had them. You picked at your shirt seams, tried to kill a few, then gave up and just accepted that you were a mobile insect hotel. Then there was the entertainment. You might picture campfires, songs, and cheerful camaraderie, and yes, sometimes that happened. But mostly, soldiers played cards, told the same jokes until they stopped being funny, or sat in silence, staring into the dark, wondering when this would all end. Occasionally someone would carve little figurines out of wood, because whittling was cheaper than therapy. Some soldiers gambled away their rations, which made them very popular the next day when they begged everyone else for food. And let's not forget the weather. Rain turned camps into swamps. Summer brought heat, flies, and the delightful stench of unwashed men. Winter meant frostbite, frozen tents, and occasionally eating your boot leather if rations failed to arrive. Modern camping trips might sound rustic, but at least you can pack marshmallows and go home when you're done. Civil War camps were basically permanent bad camping trips that lasted years. Even medical care was its own horror story. If you broke a bone, the treatment was usually amputate first, ask questions later. Anesthesia existed but wasn't always available, and antiseptics were still in their experimental stage. This meant surgeries were quick, brutal, and, from a modern perspective, unhygienic enough to make you want to wrap yourself in a bubble. If you survived the surgery, infection was waiting like a patient old friend. Doctors did their best, but their best was still operating with tools they hadn't cleaned since breakfast. And morale. Oh, morale was its own roller coaster. Letters from home could make or break a man's spirit. Some men deserted out of loneliness or despair. Others stayed because where else were they going to go? You couldn't exactly Uber back to your farm. Most soldiers just carried on, one miserable day after another, because that's what everyone else was doing. So, would you last a day? Maybe. But would you enjoy it? Almost certainly not. Between the lack of hygiene, the constant threat of sickness, the questionable cuisine, and the endless waiting, most of us would quietly request to be sent home by lunchtime. And before we drift off to the next part of our journey through history's least glamorous corners, I'm curious. What do you think would break you first in a Civil War camp? The food? The smell? The bugs? Tell me down in the comments. I want to know who would be the first to tap out. So let's drift onward, away from the muddy camp floors and into the tents of the men supposedly running the whole show. If you think the generals were any less miserable than the men under them, well, they were still miserable, just in slightly cleaner tents with slightly better food. The Civil War wasn't exactly run by stoic marble statues of military perfection. These were very human men, with human flaws, human egos, and occasionally very human meltdowns. Which, if you were a tired soldier waiting for orders, must have been an interesting combination to witness. Take General George McClellan, for instance. A man who was brilliant at organization, loved by his troops, and utterly allergic to actually fighting. McClellan was the kind of general who could turn a small skirmish into a months-long camping trip. He built the Army of the Potomac into a well-trained, disciplined force, and then mostly let it sit there. At one point, Abraham Lincoln famously said that if McClellan wasn't going to use the army, perhaps Lincoln could borrow it for a while. McClellan's men adored him, partly because he didn't seem to be in a rush to get them killed. But from a strategic standpoint, his habit of overestimating enemy numbers and hesitating at the last minute turned every battle plan into a very drawn-out maybe. If you were a soldier under McClellan, you might have been frustrated by the lack of action, but also secretly grateful you weren't charging into another meat grinder of a battle. Then there was General Ambrose Burnside, a man whose name lives on today, not because of his military genius, but because of his facial hair. Yes, sideburns are named after Burnside, whose glorious whiskers framed his face like some kind of decorative velvet curtain. His military record, unfortunately, was less impressive than his grooming. Burnside had the misfortune of being placed in charge during the Battle of Fredericksburg, which ended in disaster after disaster. His grand plan involved repeatedly sending his men charging uphill into fortified Confederate positions, which worked about as well as it sounds. After the slaughter, Burnside even offered to resign, which Lincoln politely accepted. His mustache, however, remained undefeated. And speaking of generals who became legends, there's always General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson. A man so stoic, so unshakable, that he earned a nickname suggesting he was basically a piece of military architecture. Jackson was deeply religious, deeply strange, and deeply committed to standing still under fire, literally. He believed that God would decide when his time had come, so he simply didn't flinch in battle. This made him inspiring to his men and frankly unnerving to everyone else. Off the battlefield, he had a collection of odd habits, including raising one arm while riding his horse to balance his bodily humors. Whether or not it worked is unclear, but it made him easy to spot on the battlefield, which might not have been ideal for someone constantly being shot at. On the Union side, there was Ulysses S. Grant, a man whose reputation for drinking has been exaggerated over the years but was certainly not invented. Grant was a quiet, stubborn, and effective general who didn't particularly care for ceremony or appearances. He smoked cigars, wore dusty clothes, and had a talent for just grinding through problems until they broke. Lincoln liked him for exactly that reason. "I can't spare this man," Lincoln said. "He fights." Which was more than could be said for some of the other generals. If you were a soldier under Grant, you might have felt a mix of dread and grim respect. Grant kept pushing forward, which meant you kept pushing forward too, through mud, through gunfire, through whatever was in the way. Let's not forget William Tecumseh Sherman, whose name became synonymous with total war. Sherman was brilliant, intense, and slightly terrifying. He once said, "War is hell," which was perhaps the understatement of the century, coming from a man who personally set out to make it feel that way for the Confederacy. His march to the sea cut a swath through Georgia, destroying infrastructure, supplies, and Confederate morale. He believed that the fastest way to end the war was to make it so miserable that the South couldn't keep fighting, and he was probably right, though it didn't exactly make him popular in the places he passed through. And then, of course, there were the little rivalries and moments of pettiness that don't always make it into the textbooks. Generals who didn't get along, who quarreled over promotions, who criticized each other's tactics behind their backs. Commanders on both sides occasionally refused to cooperate because they were nursing personal grudges, which meant that soldiers often found themselves caught in the middle of an argument between two men with impressive beards and fragile egos. In some ways, the Civil War was fought not just on the battlefield, but in letters, telegrams, and reports, with officers carefully phrasing their complaints so as to throw maximum shade without technically insubordinating themselves. Even the uniforms were not exactly practical. Early in the war, there wasn't even a standardized look. Some regiments wore whatever they had, which led to the occasional unfortunate friendly fire incident when no one was quite sure which side that guy over there was on. Bright colors, fancy hats, and even capes made appearances, at least until the reality of campaign life turned them all into the same shade of mud-brown. If you were a soldier, you might have looked at these men, these generals with their strange habits, indecisive moments, or flamboyant sideburns, and wondered if this was really the best humanity could come up with to lead a war. And maybe that's what makes Civil War history feel so oddly relatable. The people in charge were not flawless geniuses. They were tired, cranky, ambitious, sometimes wrong, sometimes lucky, and often just trying to make the least bad decision possible in a situation where no decision was going to be pretty. And so, as we leave the generals to argue over their maps and maneuvers, let's pause for a moment and think about what kind of general we'd be. Would you be a cautious McClellan, holding back until you were absolutely sure? A relentless Grant, grinding forward no matter the cost? Or a flamboyant Burnside, marching in with confidence and excellent facial hair? Tell me in the comments what kind of Civil War leader you think you'd make. I have a feeling most of us would choose the one who stays far away from the battlefield. Let's drift quietly from the tents of the generals back to the ordinary men who waited for orders, who wondered if the next envelope from home would bring them a bit of strength or leave them even more heartsick than before. Letters were the lifeline of a Civil War soldier. Mail was slow but deeply treasured, and men would sometimes sit in silence together, each quietly opening a letter by lantern light, reading the words from mothers, wives, sisters, or sweethearts. Some letters contained good news, a birth, a harvest, a word of encouragement. Others carried grief, telling of deaths back home or crops failing or families barely holding on. Soldiers would fold these letters and keep them close, tucked in breast pockets or under their caps, rereading them until the paper wore thin. Writing back was its own ritual. There wasn't always much to say except, "I'm still here," so they filled the pages with camp gossip, exaggerated stories of their health, and reassurances that they were warm enough, well-fed enough, brave enough, whether or not any of that was true. The loneliness in these letters is almost palpable when you read them today. Many soldiers were still teenagers, far from home for the first time, suddenly living in a world where men died of fever in the next tent overnight. Their letters often rambled, talking about the weather, the bugs, the drills, because what else was there to say? Some would tuck a pressed flower or a lock of hair into the envelope as if to bridge the distance. Others left spaces blank, unable to put into words what they had just seen on the field. And when no letter came, when the mail delivery skipped a week, men paced the camp restlessly, imagining every possible tragedy, because in that world no news was not good news. Homesickness hit hardest around holidays. Christmas in camp was a melancholy affair, with men trying to make the best of whatever rations they had, singing carols off-key, pretending that the sound of distant cannon fire was just thunder. Occasionally packages from home arrived, bringing a brief taste of normalcy, a jar of preserves, some knitted socks, maybe even tobacco or candy. Those were good days, the kind that made men smile for hours. And then the next day would come, with its mud and drills and waiting, and the cheer would quietly dissolve back into the same old gray routine. Friendships formed under those conditions that were deeper than most peacetime bonds. Men who had never met before became brothers, sharing everything from blankets to heartbreak. But quarrels flared up too, over cards, over rations, over the smallest slight, because there's only so long you can be cold, tired, and scared before your temper starts to fray. Fights broke out over things as trivial as who snored the loudest or who stole whose hardtack. And yet, when the order came to march, these same men stood shoulder to shoulder, because they were all they had. It's strange to imagine ourselves there, writing by firelight, clutching paper that might take weeks to reach home, hoping our family would know we were still breathing by the time they opened it. And that makes me wonder, if you had to write just one letter home from that camp, what would you say? Would you tell the truth, or keep it light to spare them worry? Leave me a comment and let me know. I think most of us would try to sound braver than we felt. Let's drift forward to something that occupied nearly every waking thought of the average soldier: food. We already talked about hardtack and its bonus weevils, but food in the Civil War camp could get even more inventive. Salt pork was another staple, often so salty it had to be soaked overnight before anyone could chew it. Beans, when they could be found, were cooked in iron pots until they turned into a mushy gray paste. Coffee, when it was available, was treasured like gold. Men roasted green beans over open fires, ground them with rifle butts, and brewed them in tin cups. When coffee was scarce, substitutes like chicory, rye, or even burnt bread crusts were boiled into a dark liquid and drunk with grim determination. Of course, rations weren't always distributed fairly, and soldiers often grumbled that officers seemed to get better cuts of meat. Some soldiers turned to foraging, raiding nearby farms or orchards, often to the great annoyance of local civilians. Chickens went missing with suspicious frequency whenever a regiment passed through. And if soldiers were lucky enough to find fresh fruit, they ate it immediately, knowing it might be the last fresh thing they'd taste for months. To pass the time, men played cards, checkers, or a rough version of baseball. Some whittled wood, carving pipes, or little figurines. Music was a constant presence in many camps: fiddles, banjos, harmonicas, even improvised drums. Singing became a way to fight off boredom, with soldiers belting out everything from patriotic songs to silly parodies mocking their officers. Camp concerts could break out at any hour, turning the night air into a strange mix of harmony and coughing fits. But not all entertainment was harmless. Gambling sometimes got out of hand, leading to shouting matches, fistfights, and in rare cases, duels. Alcohol also found its way into camp despite attempts to ban it, and a drunk soldier was not exactly a quiet one. Commanders had to balance keeping morale up with keeping order, which meant cracking down on fights while turning a blind eye to the occasional harmless prank. And of course, there were feuds. The same men who marched together could end up not speaking for days over something as small as a lost blanket. Cliques formed, gossip spread, and grudges simmered. But when battle came, most of those grudges dissolved in the face of survival. There's something about standing side by side under fire that makes you forget who cheated you at poker last week. So, as you imagine yourself there, sitting by the fire, eating beans with your tin spoon and listening to someone sing off-key while another man snores, I wonder, would you be the quiet one carving wood, or the loud one starting a sing-along? Tell me in the comments which kind of soldier you think you'd be: the entertainer, the grumbler, or the guy sneaking off to raid a nearby apple orchard. We should probably talk about the one thing that almost every soldier mentioned in their diaries: the smell. You might think battle was the worst part of war, but many soldiers said it was the weeks after, when the battlefield became impossible to ignore with your nose. Camps themselves were not exactly fragrant either. Imagine thousands of unwashed men, animals, cooking fires, latrines, and rotting garbage all sharing the same air. Bathing was rare and usually just a quick splash in a creek. Clothes were rarely washed, since soap was hard to come by. And boots, well, boots stayed on until they wore out or your feet did. After a battle, the smell became even more unbearable. Dead animals, destroyed supplies, and worse lingered in the heat. Men stuffed rags with tobacco or mint under their noses to block out the stench. Some wrote home describing it in grim detail, others never spoke of it again. The smell of a campaign could cling to a man for days, even weeks, long after he had marched away. And yet, they endured. They joked about it, complained about it, and kept moving. Because really, what else could they do? When you think about whether you'd last in a Civil War camp, this might be the detail that tips the scales. So here's my question for you tonight. Would you be able to handle that constant smell, or would that alone send you packing? Let me know. I suspect most of us would be holding our breath the entire time. Winter arrived not with drama, but with quiet stubbornness. The camp, already damp and miserable, took on a new personality under frost. Canvas tents became stiff in the mornings, their ropes crusted with ice. Breath hung in the air like smoke. The soldiers discovered that waiting for battle was sometimes worse than fighting it. There is at least a kind of purpose to marching forward under fire, but waiting in the cold, with nothing to do but shiver, produced a very particular kind of gloom. Food remained an adventure, if you could call it that. Salt pork froze into pale bricks. Hardtack was just as hard as ever, though now you could chip a tooth on it without even trying. The lucky men had extra socks, which they would rotate carefully like prized possessions. The unlucky ones had toes that turned frightening shades of purple, which everyone tried not to look at too closely. There were occasional amusements. Men carved dice from bits of wood or bone and played for whatever they had: a plug of tobacco, a coin, an extra blanket. They told the same jokes until they stopped being funny and became oddly comforting instead. Someone would start singing, half-heartedly at first, until others joined in. It was never very good, but it was better than silence. Letters home became the highlight of entire weeks. A soldier who received a letter would read it once, then again, then sometimes aloud to the tent just to share the sound of another world. And if there was no letter, well, they'd wait another week and hope. There was also mud. Yes, mud in winter, because even when the ground froze, the midday sun turned it into slush. You could wake up with frost on your blanket, and by lunch be standing in ankle-deep muck. It was the kind of misery that somehow became routine. Let's drift onward and see what happens when spring comes and the war refuses to end. Would you have handled the waiting and boredom better than the fighting, or would you prefer to take your chances on the battlefield? Tell me below. Spring brought a change of temperature, but not necessarily improvement. Warmer weather meant illness traveled faster. The camp hospital, such as it was, filled up with coughs, fevers, and stomach complaints. It was not exactly a place you wanted to visit, but you probably would anyway. Medical knowledge was optimistic. Surgeons did what they could with what they had, which was not much. Amputations were fast, at least, speed being the main surgical skill of the era. Opium was used freely, which probably made the world feel pleasantly fuzzy, though it did little for long-term health. Whiskey was another common treatment, though that might have been just as much for morale as medicine. Latrines were dug, filled, redug, and still somehow managed to make the air unpleasant. Flies became part of daily life. Everyone learned to live with smells they would once have run from. Hygiene was more theory than practice. Bathing, if it happened at all, was usually with cold water from a stream and not something anyone looked forward to. And yet, there was resilience. The human body, it turns out, can put up with a great deal of neglect and still stumble onward. Men wasted away, recovered, and went back to duty as though nothing had happened. Others never got back up at all. When a soldier died in camp, there was no grand ceremony. A simple grave, perhaps a wooden marker, a few words said quietly. Then it was back to work, because the war did not pause for grief. Let's drift onward to the return of movement, when the camp finally breaks and the soldiers march again. Could you tolerate these medical treatments, or would you sneak out and take your chances without them? Comment your answer. One morning, the order would come, "Pack up, we're moving." And suddenly the whole camp would lurch into activity. Tents were struck, gear rolled, fires stamped out. The smell of smoke lingered as men shouldered packs and muskets and prepared to march. Marching was its own special torment. The sun could be merciless. Dust kicked up from the road coated everything: hair, uniforms, food. Boots rubbed blisters that turned to raw wounds. The lucky ones marched near a creek and could splash their faces. The unlucky ones just sweated and kept going. Officers shouted to keep the line straight, though they rarely were. Wagons creaked and groaned under the weight of supplies. The army moved slowly, like some enormous animal dragging itself across the countryside. Sometimes there was singing to keep spirits up. Sometimes only silence and the sound of feet. And every man thought the same thing: how far until we stop? Eventually camp would be set again, and the whole routine would start over. It was as though life existed in a loop: pitch tents, cook, drill, sleep, wait. Let's keep moving with them into the long campaigns that stretched on and on. Would you enjoy the marching, a change of scenery at least, or would you dread it even more than the muddy camp? Campaign season meant more than marching, it meant uncertainty. No one quite knew when or where they might meet the enemy. Scouts came and went with scraps of news. Rumors traveled faster than facts, and everyone speculated about what might happen next. Rations were often short. Men learned to forage, to liberate vegetables from nearby farms, to cook whatever could be found. Coffee became a precious treasure. If someone brewed a pot, the smell would draw others from across camp. Shoes wore thin. Clothes tore. Beards grew wild. By mid-campaign, an army looked less like a professional force and more like a collection of weary travelers. And still they went forward. There were occasional moments of excitement, skirmishes with enemy scouts, distant cannon fire, the sight of smoke on the horizon. But more often it was just heat, dust, and the endless sound of boots on the road. Let's wander onward to what happened when the enemy actually appeared, because battle was both the thing they dreaded and the thing they'd been waiting for. Do you think the monotony or the fear of sudden battle would have been harder for you? And then, one morning, there it was. Not a grand announcement, just a sense of it in the air. Drums beating faster. Officers riding back and forth. Lines being formed. The soldiers took their places. Some looked pale. Some cracked jokes they didn't really find funny. The sound of distant cannon made the ground tremble. And then the orders came, and they went forward. This was the moment they had been preparing for through all those long days of waiting. And it was loud, confusing, and full of smoke. The world shrank to the next step forward, the next order shouted, the next musket fired. When it was over, however it ended, the men looked older, more tired. There was a strange quiet that followed battle, as though the world itself held its breath. And then came the work of tending the wounded, counting the missing, writing the letters home no one wanted to write. And then, somehow, it was back to camp life again. Because the war still wasn't done. Let's keep drifting forward into the final days, when the end is near but somehow still far away. Would you have stayed calm on the battle line, or would you have been one of the pale, nervous ones in the back? As the war dragged toward its conclusion, the soldiers grew quieter. They were hardened now, not just by marching, but by everything they had seen. The last camps were smaller, more organized. Experience had taught them how to build better shelters, how to keep cleaner, how to make a little comfort where there had been none. But the weariness was deep. Everyone wanted to go home. The talk around campfires turned to farms, families, cities far away. Plans for after the war grew elaborate, though many knew life would never quite be the same. When the final orders came, there was relief more than celebration. They packed camp one last time, marched one last road, and watched one last sunrise as soldiers. Let's follow them home, quietly, to see what came next. Do you think you'd feel relief at the war's end, or would the quiet feel strange after so long in camp? Homecoming was not like the parades in the newspapers. Most soldiers simply walked back into their towns, thinner, quieter, carrying what was left of their gear. Families embraced them, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with tears. The world had gone on without them. Farms had changed. Shops had closed or reopened. Children had grown taller. It felt almost like stepping into a dream you'd left behind. Some men never quite got used to sleeping in a bed again. The quiet was too much. Others married, worked, and built lives that seemed ordinary, though they never forgot the taste of hardtack or the sound of rain on canvas. And that was camp life. Miserable, ordinary, extraordinary all at once. Thanks for staying with me through this whole slow wander through a Civil War camp. If this helped you relax, give it a like. It helps more sleepy history fans find their way here. If you want more calm history storytelling, subscribe and join me every week for new journeys into the past. And I'd love to know, after hearing all 12 parts, which part of camp life do you think you would have handled best, and which would have been your breaking point? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I always read them before recording the next episode.